And everyone, please put your hands together for Matt Booty. Matt, it is fantastic to have you here at XDS. Thank you for joining me for this.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here and looking forward to our chat. Thank you.
You have been incredibly busy at Xbox Game Studios over the last, well, always, but over the last several years, there's been just a ton of activity. How has that been for you? Has it been, win after win after win, or has it been a roller coaster?
Well, first, it's just always fantastic to be able to work with the great teams. I think the best part of the acquisitions is meeting with the teams and getting to learn more about them and getting to go behind the scenes of the work on their games. I love my job. I wish I could spend more time closer to the teams just because I love the craft of what we do. That's been great. We'll say that like everybody, I think in this industry and just in our country and around the world, making games during the pandemic, the shift to work from home, changing how we do things, it's been a challenge, right? It certainly has been a challenge. It's affected small studios differently than some of the bigger studios. So a little bit on that roller coaster. It's great to be on the coaster, but there certainly have been some challenges in the last 18 months. But I think the great teams that we've got, being able to work with people like Tim Schafer, you and I were chatting about Psychonauts 2 that just came out, and just, congrats to that team. And just being around the craft of what we do always keeps me excited.
Well, it's incredible to see, from the outside. I want to dig into your history, though, because it's not just Xbox that is a part of your story, and you've got a fascinating story. But first of all, what brought you into the games industry, and what did your family and friends say when you started your career?
Well, I actually got started in games in audio. So I came out of Purdue University with a weird mixture of degrees, an engineering degree, electrical and computer engineering, but then also a Master of Fine Arts degree with a focus on music. So I had this weird music plus software mix. So I started at Midway Games in Chicago, which was actually Williams, Bally, and Midway. Williams and Bally were the pinball side, and Midway was the video game side. And that was a time when people like Eugene Jarvis, the creator of Robotron, was there. So actually, funny story, when I called to get the job right out of school, the guy that they transferred me to was Eugene. So I spent an hour on the phone talking to Eugene, really didn't know who he was, and was fortunate that he took a lot of time and has been a great mentor to me even since then. So yeah, it was came into games doing really audio hardware, audio software, working on sound systems. And it was a little bit of a head scratcher for some people. I mean, games at the time weren't really a mainstream career the way they are today, a long time later. So, but I had always been interested. So people that knew me didn't think it was that much of a stretch, but it certainly was more non-traditional then than it is now.
Did you know inside of you that it was going to be your career once you got a taste of it?
It's a great, insightful question. I went through, as part of an engineering degree, through some great jobs during college to pay for school. And then as part of my Master of Fine Arts, had worked on a bunch of productions and did theater. But there was always this intersection of art and technology coming together that appealed to me. And I think that was the thing, even when I was younger, going to the grocery store and started seeing the first games out there like Defender, this idea that this thing that you could control these buttons and it made these things on screen move around, and it was all just like right there, like this immediacy to it that fascinated me. So there was no question when I showed up there.
And the guy that made Defender answered the call.
That's just right.
It's insane.
And Midway was an interesting place back then, just because engineering was part of the factory. So like you walk into work past a factory with hundreds of pinball games lined up, hundreds of video games lined up.
Wow.
And at night, they would all be on self-test and making noise. And then in the morning, the semi-trucks would back up and they'd put these big refrigerator-sized boxes and ship them out, right? So it was like you were right there in the middle of it in terms of how they were built. So it was a wonderland. I mean, coming out of school, in terms of just being on the edge of that tech and being at the edge of kind of that rebirth of the arcade in the early 90s, it was a great time.
Well, we say that, the rebirth of the arcade, but that was because of Midway, because the arcade had really crashed with consoles getting better, and the consoles had already crashed. And so video games looked like, they could fall away at any time. And it's a precipitous industry and it changes all the time for sure. But talk to us about Midway Games, because I am astounded that there are generations of people that love video games, that love them, that don't have any connection to that era or the games that they made, or they know a little bit but not the whole story. Talk to us about Midway.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, as somebody being young, it was just a great privilege to be able to learn the art and craft of making games. There were some interesting things that you can learn from making arcade games. I'll say the first is just that customer feedback loop is very, very direct, right? Like we have today telemetry and we do flighting and we do tests. I'll say when you build a game, we would build one prototype. We would take it to an arcade, usually on a Friday night, and put it in the arcade. And then we would stand there sort of off to the side and watch people play it. And I'll just say that there are a few things that'll kind of hit you more in the gut than seeing somebody put a quarter in a game and then halfway through walk away. Or seeing people get frustrated and like pound on the machine because it's not doing what they expect it to do. And usually what would happen is, that people would go back that night and we're gonna go work on this and then bring it back the next morning on Saturday with new code to try it out. So that feedback loop, I think, is a good lesson to take away. The other thing that I learned from working with people, the general manager at the time was a guy named Ken Fidesna. And from him, I really learned this really is about empowering creators. Like we are a creator-led business, a creator-led industry. And there are marketing forces that have to come in. There are business aspects to what we do. But one of the things that I try to bring to Xbox Game Studios today is we've got to be organized around supporting the game team, supporting the game creator. And that was a time when a game could be built with 2 or 3 people. The very first Mortal Kombat was Ed Boon writing the code, John Tobias doing the art. That's a 2-person team. Dan Forden did the audio, but he was probably working on 3 or 4 games at the time. And it was all about the creator, right? This sort of artist, this idea that there was a person who had an idea for a complete game in their head and they were going to bring this to fruition. And I think that was a big takeaway. And the other thing that at the time, to just state a third thing, was you put it really well. There needed to be something to bring people back into the arcade that they couldn't get on Super Nintendo, they couldn't get on Genesis. And it just had to be innovation in terms of graphics. I was lucky enough to work on Cruisin' USA, which was a racing game made by Eugene Jarvis. And that was done somewhat in partnership with Nintendo around this new graphics chip. Today, we'd call it a GPU, but at the time, it was this graphics chip, right? 3D graphics weren't really a thing yet. I got to work with a company, 3DFX, which was really one of the first video card companies, if you remember, before we ended up where we are now. So those takeaways, that first, that immediacy of your players and paying attention to what they like, what they don't like, and getting that, somehow you've got to have that feedback loop. The second, empower creators. And then third, it took that new technology to keep people interested. That's one of the biggest differences, I think, between games and entertainment, like movies, linear entertainment, is that the technology matters so much, right? It's why we get excited about Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 and the new NVIDIA video card. It's just a real integral part of our craft, I think.
And that constant reinvention and iteration on concepts, many of which were developed by that crew, quite frankly, but taking those ideas and just iterating like crazy. But you were there during, NARC and Smash TV and NBA Jam and Mortal Kombat and NFL Blitz, and each one of those things was just a massive force out into pop culture. Was your head spinning, or were you guys just like, okay, well, this is the way it's always going to go?
Yeah, well, I absolutely was lucky and privileged to be around and learn from guys like Mark Turmel, who made Smash TV, who went on to run NBA Jam and was behind NFL Blitz. Like we mentioned, get to work with Eugene. I did some audio work on Cruisin' USA with Eugene. I did the audio, parts of the audio system and code for Mortal Kombat 2. So just working with Ed and those guys, how lucky I was to see that. And later on, to be able to get to run a game team and, have sort of my own shot at designing some things, was sort of later in the evolution of the arcade. But yeah, it was a really interesting time. I mean, when we would put games out on test in an arcade, this is sort of before the internet, but it would become a thing. The word would get out and people would show up, and you would sort of get a lot of immediate feedback as these games would go out into the arcade. And then, back then, so much of what we learned about games was through magazines, right? Like EGM back at the time. And, you'd see you knew you had something when people were calling because they wanted to do the strategy guides and the cheat books. And you'd start to, we got the cover of EGM. So it was a fun time. It was definitely a unique point in time. And I think it's one of those times where a lot of talent was concentrated in one place. And the lineage of that you can still see out in the industry today. I mean, I was just talking with Ed Boone last weekend, and he's still going strong. There's still people at NetherRealm that we all work together in our 20s, and it's just so great to see them still making games and doing what they love. Yeah,
and kicking butt. Yeah, well. We're going to move off of Midway here in a second, but I get asked about a PsyOps sequel all the time, still, all the time. It was a great game. And so I just wanted to see if you wanted to confirm that Xbox is going to make a PsyOps sequel for the world.
Well, PsyOps, of course, was built by Brian Eddy, and Brian's a great game designer and a good friend. Brian is still to this day designing pinball games, like some of the most famous pinball games, things like Medieval Madness, Attack from Mars. Those are all Brian Eddy games, and the guy's just a great game designer. I think the closest to a PsyOps sequel was Remedy's Control, actually.
Yes,
wonderful
and Psychonauts 2 a little bit too.
A little bit, yeah. I smile when I played Control, and it's always great talking with Remedy. They are a wonderful creative team, and that gets to just. There are some core mechanics and fundamental gameplay things in our business that I think will just always keep showing up again. And it's cool to see the latest spins on them.
Absolutely. So you rose through the ranks at Midway, and you were able to manage a bunch of teams and work with international groups. Was that great preparation for your evolution into Microsoft?
Well, I had the great opportunity to do some acquisitions, right? Midway was expanding at the time, and we saw that home consoles were coming, and we needed to put our attention there. PC gaming, you could tell it was interesting when, people in the office our teams were spending time playing Quake and things like that. It's like, okay, well, this, World of Warcraft, this stuff is getting attention. We've got to start putting attention there. I like to tell the funny story that in my career, I actually got written up once for playing too much Descent at work when we all got our new Pentium 90s, if that means anything to anybody. But at the time,
totally understandable. And I'm right there with you. That was an amazing game back then.
That's what we did. So I got to be there along with, my bosses and the people that I worked with. We acquired things like Surreal Software, which was here in Seattle. We actually had a studio in the UK, a studio in Australia. So that was the first chance to really understand what it meant to bring some of those studios internal. And we had, some successes and some failures there. I mean, certainly there were studios that we bought that we had to close. There were, I think Surreal Software was another one of those places here in Seattle where there's a concentration of talent, and it's cool to see some of that talent has moved on, some of which is here in Xbox, some of it even over at one of our studios, Undead Labs here in Seattle. So that was good learning. And then also just thinking about the difference of, how do you manage at scale, right? My job day to day is really about supporting game teams, making sure they have what they need to be successful, making sure that they feel that there's a creative environment, right? And I'm not anywhere close to the production anymore. And, that was, I'll say that was a change. That was something I kind of wrestled with, because it's tempting when you've got access to those teams to kind of keep your nose in it and want to go poke around, and, they'll let you just because they kind of have to, but it's really, I always sort of joke around, nobody needs me playing frustrated game designer. Nobody needs me poking around in their code, right? So
that's a really big lesson, isn't it, Matt? Because I know, and I hear from people, because I've been doing this for so long, that I hear as, people move through their career, they become less and less hands-on with the stuff that got them into this business in the first place. And that's something that you mentally have to kind of prepare yourself for, right?
Yeah. I think It's a, let's say, I like to approach it as I feel a responsibility to be informed about our craft, right? So I think it's important that I understand how Houdini's being used. I think it's important to think about how we're using procedural terrain and procedural environments. I think it's important for me to understand how ray tracing works and what it means and what hardware you do and don't need and where it should be used in a game. I think it's important for me to understand what kind of roles we've got on our team, just because that sets me up to better support a team and to lobby for them and to advocate for them. With that interest, though, can come excitement. And, I've got to watch it there. I try to channel that excitement into just doing my own projects, right? So that if I've got this urge, I can go work on my own little projects on the side, get that out of my system. I did laugh once. We were doing a tour of a studio, and I overheard the chief of the staff for the studio say that, oh, we've got a broken arrow, which I guess was their word for I had spent too much time and was sitting down with one of the artists asking questions about what they were doing in Blender and like how Blender differs from Maya and how
they
it's
had a code word.
And didn't realize that I'd been sitting there for about 15 minutes with this person. So I got to get him back on the studio tour. So it's fun. I've always, the best part of my job is being able to do game reviews. It bumped like probably the biggest bummer of the last year, 18 months is we're just not doing studio visits like we used to. It's just like, it's such a great feeling to be in a studio, that buzz and how everything is going on. But yeah, that was a change. Like you get distance from the product and I think we've got a responsibility to stay up to speed with our craft, but at the same time, have the discipline to keep our hands out of it.
Well, I've heard this about Microsoft. It's a company that serves so many different categories, and games is an important thing, but it's only one thing that it's focused on, which gives Xbox some really good perspective and stability. That's what I've heard from other people that work at Microsoft. Is that something that are you learning constantly from these other disciplines and other interests that Microsoft has?
Yeah, we're super fortunate to be part of a bigger enterprise company that recognizes the value of games and supports it so well. And my boss, Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, over the years, he has done a remarkable job of charting a path that really positions Xbox as a legitimate consumer-facing presence within Microsoft. And, the advice that I've gotten from Phil and the advice that I've gotten from our CEO, Satya, who's wonderful, has been, look, there's going to be some things that you're probably going to need to do differently because you're a part of this big enterprise company. And that makes you different than, say, an Ubisoft or an Electronic Arts. But try to balance that out by taking advantage of the things that are available to you. And you mentioned a big one, which is stability. I think another one is just access that we have to things like Microsoft Research. If you've played the latest flight simulator, there's things that we're doing there where we start with satellite imagery, but satellite imagery is so uneven. You get it from so many different sources and different resolutions. The way we're able to generate that scenery is using very, very complicated AI and machine learning to look at the satellite imagery, figure out what we're looking at, and then go recreate that in 3D to a standard that we've got within the simulator. So we look at a piece of imagery and say, those are pine trees. This is a suburban city. That's a river. And then we go and build that with a coherent look within the simulation. But that level of AI, I mean, I just can't imagine that a game team just can't put that level of resource behind it. So that's just one great example where, we're able to really work with a team within Microsoft. I think the work we're doing with Azure around cloud, we've just, I think, begun to scratch the surface of what can be done. If you know that you've got a game running in a dedicated cloud environment with a sophisticated fabric across it, how would you design a game differently? And I think we're just beginning to barely scratch the surface of that.
Well, not to mention your services kind of ideas around Game Pass and xCloud. I mean, it's a competitive world in the video game space, but there has been this universal acknowledgement that you guys are really pushing the medium forward in some exciting ways and really kind of challenging the way that we conceive of how games are played and acquired. You're shaking things up in massive ways. Was that something that you guys knew instinctually, or was that something that it's you're constantly iterating and learning from?
Well, I think it comes down to a few things. I think the first is that we've got to give credit to Phil, who, like, his ability as a leader to be visionary, I think, here. And he had a picture of where this could go. And I think that planted the seed. But, a seed needs a place to grow. And I think the interesting thing about being part of Microsoft is that it's a dynamic environment. Our CEO has really embraced this culture of what we call a growth mindset. Ask questions. What could be different? Don't come at things with an expert point of view. Like, take this beginner's mindset of, what if we knew nothing? What if we knew nothing about how games are supposed to work? What would we perhaps do differently, right? And then thirdly is that support that we talked about. I mean, getting into things like cloud streaming at scale with our xCloud and Xbox Cloud Gaming, getting into things like Game Pass. I'll just say it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen certainly with some wonderful people out there in the industry, some competitors who have had some successes and some retreats in different places. We don't take any of that for granted. I think that it's all very volatile, but we definitely feel supported and feel supported to take some risks there.
Yeah, it's a long game. You can, and you need that. I think that's the strength, right? And from the outside, that's what it looks like. It's like Microsoft isn't like flipping a switch. We're going for just the long game. We're going to see where this takes us.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with somebody this morning about that. It's interesting you asked that question. The example that I brought up was our game Sea of Thieves, which, to be honest, when the game first came out, some of the reviews were it didn't have enough content, there wasn't enough to do. This is an interesting idea, but where does this go? And then here we are 2.5, 3 years later. Just earlier this summer, we put our Pirates of the Caribbean tie-in that we did, which I think is wonderful. And, it starts to show this hint that Sea of Thieves is really kind of a platform, but we've stuck with it. And I think you could have looked at the curves for the MAU, the usage. And if you looked at that first year, you might have said, wow, this thing is trailing off. Like, maybe we just okay, great. We made this pirate game. Let's move on. But the team had a vision for where it could go, and we stuck with it. And, those things are hard to build when you've got something that can actually become, I don't want to overuse the word. Sometimes we tend to overstretch the meaning of things, but it's got enough structure to it that we can do things like bring in Pirates of the Caribbean, bring in other stories, and start to focus on more things to do in the game. There's a critical mass there that I think only comes with being patient.
I love it. I'm going to ask you a couple of external dev questions, and then we are going to get into the Q&A. But I have one selfish question that I have for you. PlayStation just had a killer showcase talking about Spider-Man and Wolverine. And superhero video games are hot. I happen to enjoy the superhero stuff. So I am wondering if there are plans afoot at Microsoft. You don't have to tell us what it might be or if it's of interest, but are you guys looking at the superhero category?
Well, first, I just love your questions and opportunity, of course, to just give a huge shout out to Insomniac. I mean, what an amazing studio. Spider-Man, what well-produced games. I think we can all look at Wolverine, and all you need to hear is Wolverine, Insomniac, and they probably didn't even need the CG trailer, which is great, but they probably didn't even need it. It's just Insomniac's making Wolverine, and everybody gets excited, which is wonderful, and congrats to them and Ted and everybody there. We've got, again, one of the things that comes with being part of Microsoft is partnerships that we can do, right? We've had partnerships and things that we're looking at where we can bring in other IPs. So I think you can expect some of that. I really can't get into it more, but we've announced some things. We've also done some things in the past, and I think we should assume that we'll keep going. The most amazing thing to me, and I'll just kind of tie this back to what you were talking about, that longevity. Who would have thought that a character created in the 1960s would be today driving some of the most cutting edge entertainment that we've got in terms of Wolverine
Period.
and Spider-Man.
Yeah,
It's just
across the spectrum in games for sure, but in just in everywhere you look. I can't believe it as a big comic nerd for so long. It's like we're in heaven. It's incredible.
Yeah, I don't know that it would have been predicted, but I think that gets back to that power of the creators, the power of IP, the power of characters. What are the things that have lasted 50 years through paper to movies to video games is the idea of a teenager who is awkward but acquires superpowers. And what do you do when you become Spider-Man? Like, who is Wolverine? What does it mean to be an outcast among heroes? Like, those are the stories that I think last 50, 60 years.
Agreed. All right. Well, what are some of the key things that you look for when you're contracting an external development studio?
Well, so much of what we do is built on relationships. And so I think that we come into any partnership, which they're just so much more complex, right? And so I think they have to start with that relationship. Like, who are the people that we know there? Who are we going to talk to? How do we think more long-term? I mean, I can think back to a time when just even saying that we were going to go hire external concept artists, or we were going to hire some people to do some 3D modeling, would kind of get a team on it. What? Like, how can that even work, right?
Yeah.
And and now we've got a complete discipline, the outsourcing producer, outsourcing tools, outsourcing pipelines. That's a whole craft within itself within games. So I think we look at people that we can, studios, firms, people that we can start to build on for the long term. Because when you get into the hot and heavy part of production, and when you get into more scale and complexity, you want to have that relationship. I really think that's what we start with. And then it's an intangible, but it comes through when you have conversations, when you look at work. It's just the dedication to the craft, right? Like, is there a real dedication to what the output is and wanting to be part of it? And we want that. I have this view that in a video game, one of the things I love about making a game is the fingerprints of everybody who worked on that game come through on the pixels on the screen. And whether that's someone who, let's we're going to make Forza Horizon 5 coming up here. If that's somebody that built cars for us and started with a CAD drawing from a manufacturer, but put the craft into making that car that shows up on screen, all the way to somebody who wrote the code for the reflections, like, those fingerprints show up in the game. And we want the people that we work with in a co-dev relationship to feel that they've got that path to their fingerprints, their DNA showing up on the screen as much as anything.
This is my last question for you, and then we're going to head over to the XDS networking hub. But how much has remote work flipped this equation, and has it created more opportunity for co-dev?
I think it has. I would put the opportunity for co-dev. I feel like there's some pretty fundamental shifts going on in how we're going to make games, and perhaps these were in place before we got into a pandemic situation, with accelerated some of the work from home and the remote work. But certainly it is going to push the development of technology to allow us to, I'll just get like very, very brass tacks here. We will have to develop better technology for reviewing high-res, high-frame rate assets remotely. Like, we just have to be able to do that. Now we get people in a room with a color balanced monitor in 4K, and we want to look at it. Whether it's using Parsec or some other tool, we're going to have just our own teams need that. I think that's going to open up avenues for co-development that are going to come with that. The other thing is, I just think our team structures, the way we build teams, the way we parse out tasks, the way planning is done, is going to have to accommodate people in different time zones, people even just engaging at different times of the day, even that might live a block away, but their rhythm during the day is a little different. And I think that's going to also make it easier for us to work with external suppliers, external co-developers, from the range from people that are building levels and writing core code for us, all the way to people just providing assets or doing important things like localization. I think it's just going to be our rhythm of business will adapt to make that more fluid.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to get into a Q&A. We're going to open it up to you guys to ask questions. We're going to move to the XDS Networking Hub presented by Roommate. If it's not already in your calendar, you go to the homepage of XDS Connect, scroll down to current session, and select View Session to join our Q&A right now. And don't forget to press the big play button in the center of the screen. We'll be right back. I'm joined again by Matt Booty, who is the head of Xbox Game Studios. And this is your time to ask Matt some questions about his career and his observations and about how you may be able to work with Xbox or get his wisdom on being a good co-dev for different partner studios out there. I've got a couple of questions here. This one's from Junie. Your diverse range of studios simply can't be compared one-on-one. How do you measure success for and stimulate development and growth in individual studios and their products?
That's a great, insightful question. As we see a shift away from just straight up unit sales, which I think has been the way the game industry has measured our success for so long, a Metacritic score, unit sales, and we get into more service-based things, we really look at it as, I think the way we start to have to think about things more even in a, how do you measure the success of a show in a streaming service like Netflix or Hulu? So I think it's pretty obvious when you've got something that's being critically well received. Perhaps review scores aren't as dependable as they used to be. I think that dynamic has changed. But earlier in the session before, we were talking about the fact that I had the great chance to work with people like Eugene Jarvis early in my career. And Eugene said something to me once, just walking out of the building late one night. He said, you know how you've got a good game? People tell you you have a good game. And I think that it still matters for our studios, right? So there's, it when you've got some critical acclaim. Like look at what we're seeing for Deathloop out of Arcane right now. The conversations just say that's a good game. Then we just
you guys published a good PlayStation game there, Matt. Good job.
It was the unique experience of watching the Sony show last week and seeing two Xbox games in there. So we really look at the critical reception. Then we've got a number of things that we look at in terms of how the game performs in Game Pass. Do we see people engaging with the game? Do we see people playing it? And, one of the things to be clear about is that we don't have any pressure or push for everybody to try to go build something like Destiny that is so good at driving recurring engagement, right? We've got teams that are building small, self-contained, narrative-based games, the kind of things like Hellblade. Our studio in Montreal, Compulsion Games, is making a game like that. So the next is, do we see success in terms of the engagement inside Game Pass? And then for me, a more intangible part of it is, did the game move the studio forward on their journey, right? Studios that have been around for 20 years, things like Insomniac. I think Insomniac's been around for 27 years, which is great. They've got a certain journey, but a studio like, let's just take one of our studios, Undead Labs, that makes our State of Decay franchise. We've seen some amazing things about that franchise and its ability to bring in a really diverse group of players and to take a kind of unique community twist on that genre. But we also know there's things that game can do to get better, right? Around the graphics, around the animation. And these are all things we've talked about with the studio and want to support them on. So I looked like, did the game help the team take a step forward in their evolution? And, and those things happen incrementally. So it's a great question and something that, we certainly look at, and it's changing because it used to be very easy to measure a game's success. And I think that how that lens has changed quite a bit.
You brought up something around the Sea of Thieves game. We also used to see the iterative kind of growth in IP. You'd see like Burnout 1 to 3, like 3 really took off. It really kind of changed. The Grand Theft Auto 3 used to be, if a studio got the chance to make sequels, there was a tangible improvement there. And that wasn't always the case, like PsyOps 2. But now we're seeing games like No Man's Sky and Sea of Thieves. They just keep improving within that sphere. And I guess Game Pass is a conduit to both of those types of models.
Yeah, I think To sort that out, it's a great question. When I mentally think, I think of Game Pass as that's the presentation. That's how we deliver, right? And I wouldn't want us to take the presentation mechanism, the delivery mechanism, and have it overly influence like how we build games, right? So I had the privilege of working with the Minecraft team for 3 years very directly. That was the team that I had leadership with. And, I learned from them just what you want to talk about like iterative content in the extreme. I think that team ships over 70 updates a year for 20 plus platforms. And so that will just force your head into that mindset. But I also think there's room for, let's stop, pause. Sometimes you can't always update the plane while you're flying it, right? And so things like we will do Forza Horizon 5 coming up, and that is a discrete new product apart from Forza Horizon 4. Now, Forza Horizon 4 had ongoing content. We've seen great engagement, but there are times when I think you've got to pause, whether it's to integrate a new version of an engine, to really sort of break down your engine because there's new tech, maybe retool your thinking. And I think, we're lucky that we've got a platform that allows us to have both of those, both the discrete update and something like Minecraft that's always updated.
Very cool. We could go deep on Game Pass conversation stuff here, but I want to get to a couple more questions. Where is an area / realm of games that you would like to see or challenge the game industry to be more creative in? And what skills and technology would be needed to support that creative vision, the long game? This is from Richard Walsh.
Yeah, great question. I'll sort of bridge just because you mentioned Game Pass in our platform. I think one of the advantages is it allows us to make games that are explore new themes, right? So one of the places that we absolutely need to go as an industry is we've got to go out and find more voices, right? We've got to find more stories and from people that don't look like me, right? We've got to go. There's a whole world of game ideas, game developers, game designers, people that have stories to tell, characters to show us that come from a much more diverse background of our whole planet, as opposed to the people who have traditionally led video game development. So no question that we've got to go out and find more diverse voices. And I think that's both an opportunity and a responsibility that we've got. It's one of the things that I think is a focus for us. We have a first party publishing team. That's how we work with studios like Don't Nod that made the game Tell Me Why. And that really gives us an opportunity to go out and find those voices, those new voices, diverse voices. So that's an area of focus for us for sure. Another one is I just think that games have the unique ability to allow the player, the participant, to come in and be a co-author of the content, right? Like it's at the simplest level, it's user-generated content, but I think the interaction between a game community, the community of players, the community of people making the game, it just all starts to kind of take on a life of its own. And certainly that's the case with something like a Roblox or a Minecraft. But even with our new version of Flight Simulator, bringing the marketplace into the product has created this whole community around what can be made inside Flight Simulator. We get so many calls from people in industry even asking, like, could I use Flight Simulator to go do this other thing? Right. And like, how do we start to co-author this stuff? So, the work that Todd Howard and team have done on things like Skyrim, things that you see in RPGs, there's fertile ground there for exploring what it means to bring the players into the world. And so to the question that was asked, I think that the tools that we're going to need, the systems that we're going to need, is that really any game that was being built from scratch today has got to have an architecture. It's got to have an approach and a pipeline so that the players can participate, whether that's through something like Halo Forge or whether that's through Minecraft where we have scripting, any game has got that avenue. I think that's really going to be a focus, and it's going to need a different set of tools that provide an on-ramp and some guardrails, but also make things accessible.
Awesome. Bradley Heitmeyer asks, what are some of the major changes in games from way back when to today, technology aside, and where do you see trends heading towards for the future of games?
This is a great one. A couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, I probably would have said that the biggest difference is scale and specialization, right? So when you think about, I think, there were 1 or 2 or 3 programmers on an arcade game back in the 90s. And even when there were console games, it used to be you'd go buy an Atari 2600 game and it would be, Pitfall by so-and-so, the person that made
David
it.
Crane, yeah.
Yeah, you talk about the person who made Asteroids, right? And
yes.
this idea. And now, we've got games like Battlefield and Halo with hundreds, possibly thousands of people working on the game. So scale is certainly one. And that starts to impact like how we work together as a team and how you work together with teamwork and what the processes are. However, the reason my answer on that has kind of changed is I think that we're seeing that the technology has finally become, in some ways, accessible and available enough that it would be completely possible for you and I to go start a small game studio, right? I look at, what a studio like Moon Studios was able to deliver with Ori. And, that is they don't have an office.
Completely remotely before all of the pandemic too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Fully distributed and making use of tools to stay connected. And what a beautiful, amazing product. And so, I think that in a way, what's old is new again. And what has enabled that is some of the technology. And within the context of what we're talking about here, never before has there been such an array of services available in the industry. Let's just roll with this. You and I go start a studio and we need somebody that's going to go do some motion capture for us. There's somebody we can call to go do that. And we need to find a composer to write the music. And there's a whole, Brian Schmidt, who's someone who I knew from back in the old pinball days. He runs a whole audio sound conference. And, there's all kinds of people we could go hire to go do that. So, it's pretty interesting. So in some ways, a lot has changed, but also in some ways, it's still the same.
I love it. And at the core is just this desire to communicate in an interactive and unique way every time, right?
Yeah, I just real quick, it's so funny. This is a little bit of a tangent. There's a thing out there called 13 kilobit games, which is this whole competition of, can you write a game in JavaScript that is like,
yes, I played the Journey on there a few years ago, I think.
I rat holed the other night, but there's this simple little game that it's just this side scrolling thing. And I'm like, I've been playing this thing for 20 minutes. Right? And to your point,
good game is a good game, man. That's like, people ask me, what's your favorite game all the time? I'm sure they ask you too. And Robotron is in that list, like Robotron from 1981. Still incredible. Yeah. All right. This one's also from Junie. How do you facilitate and stimulate knowledge and experience sharing between studios? This is excellent, particularly across different levels of seniority and disciplines.
That is a wonderful question. So there's a couple of parts to the answer. The first is, I think that any team will tell you that in the abstract, sharing code, sharing ideas, getting together and talking about how you do things, of course, that's beneficial. The practical day-to-day reality, though, is that any team has got to focus on shipping their game. And so there's always this tension between, I've got my game to get done, how much time can I devote to going to help this other team, or even to write up what I did so that it's useful? And then we start to say, well, we could formalize that with some more central teams, right? And we can have these central groups. But then you even start to get into a little bit of the tension of, what does it mean to be on the central group versus being on the game team? Right. And I never want to kind of create this division of, there's one better than the other. The way that we are solving it right now is our principle is that we really first and foremost want to maintain the creative autonomy of the studios. So that means not trying to impose a lot of central functions on top of them. Doesn't mean that that's not great. There's a continuum. It's just where we happen to be today. Doesn't mean it's the best. It's just what we happen to be today. And so what we've done are what we call summits. And these summits are based around a subject matter. And they are a grassroots thing that is somebody raises their hand and volunteers and says, I want to put on a performance capture summit. I want to put on a narrative design summit. I want to do a UI UX summit. And then what we have, and what I have a team as part of my sort of central staff, is a team that can then go support them to put on that summit, right? So if they've got the topic, if they can get together people that want to share and talk about that, they're usually about 2 days, similar format to this, where there'll be hour-long presentations and talks, and they are information sharing and ways for people to keep up to date with what are other studios doing. Then we'll bring in external people. Epic could come in and talk about what's their new lighting in UE5. We'll get Unity to come in. What are the new things that are available? We like to bring in partners. The main piece of feedback that I'll hear from that is that, one, it works. It's great networking, and it builds those connections where they're needed. Because every time you, as I sort of started out talking about, every time you try to build a connection or matrix something, it better be useful, because there's a cost. And then the feedback that we've gotten, though, is that people would love to be able to have a way to hear about those things before they get started on something. Because often by the time you hear about, that would have been great for us to use, but we're already a year into this animation system. We're already using branding. We're already using this lighting approach. And a turn of the crank is every 2, 3, 4, 5 years for us these days, right? So that's something we're working on. It's a wonderful question, is how do we send up earlier signals so that if people at least get an idea, Obsidian's working on this new narrative design tool and dialogue tool, how could we use that at some other studio? Just how can we get awareness earlier into that?
And I guess the challenge is you have to work very hard to keep each artistic kind of fingerprint of each game looking different from the other one as you bring your teams together in some semblance of solidarity and working together and sharing information. You want there to be this distinct taste for each one of these games.
Yeah, it's a great point. The word we actually use is a sort of a federation. It's kind of the best word that I've come up with for, we're loosely attached, but we don't try to do too much central governing. I think it is important. Our craft is unique, and it's one of the things that I love about it, that the technology does inform the product, right? Like when you watch a movie, I'm sure there's people out there that follow what cameras were used to make it, and they love all the behind the scenes stuff, but yet you don't read about that stuff in the reviews, and it doesn't, people don't really pay attention to it. But a game, the technology and the presentation is like a core part of the experience. And so you do want a wide range of tools available so that they can pursue what they think matches the story they're trying to tell.
When you've done one of these summits, how often are you introducing executives from one studio to executive? Because I've found that, because I've had the privilege of, going to visit a lot of these studios in my career. And I have made a lot of introductions at a GDC, like people that are fans of each other have just never talked to each other. Are you finding that now? I mean, you've kind of built your own GDC at Microsoft.
Well, I'll say for the most part, these summits, we really try to connect the people that are actually doing the work. So they are very much trade and craft, right? And we want the people that are doing the work. Now, it's one of the things right before we ended up moving to working from home and having to face the challenges of the pandemic, we had the awesome opportunity to get all of our studio heads together in one place in New York City. And the first meeting that we had the one morning, sort of walk into the room and you look around this room at all these people, and it's like 300 years of game design experience.
That's amazing,
and to your point, it's people meeting Tim Schafer for the first time, and it's people realizing our Xbox chief of staff, a woman named Mary, turns out that her brother actually was a software programmer who worked with Tim early on, and like people are just connecting these life stories, and that's the cool stuff, right? When you bring that together, and there's a different kind of connection that happens between those studio heads and those creative directors.
Sure.
And I just, we need to embrace remote work. We need to embrace all ways of getting games done. Something I hope we don't lose is the ability to do things like that, like bring all those creative leaders together, because it's a real cool moment.
Well, I hope that the plan is to one day, live stream that gathering of talent. I think the world needs to see it. Well, at least 1 hour of it, maybe not the whole thing.
That is an interesting idea, right? I know that talking with Todd Howard and Todd Vaughn, as we've gotten to know them better at ZeniMax and Bethesda, they have an annual meeting. I think they've got a different word for it, but every December they would everybody flies into Maryland and they do the same sort of thing, or just days of presentations and networking and things. And how cool that would be. So I look forward to when they get those back up, to kind of coming and sitting in and being a fly on the wall for one of those.
Does it blow your mind sometimes that your company owns Doom?
Yeah,
it blows my mind.
Doom and Quake and so many
Yes.
things. I mean, there are some funny moments. You start getting, there's probably a reality TV show in here somewhere, but if you start with Obsidian and Fergus Urquhart, who's the studio head there, you've got Brian Fargo at In Exile. There's Common Ground there that goes all the way back to Interplay, that goes back to Fallout, that comes forward through to Bethesda. There's some family tree drama there that I'm sure
you've got the web, man. You've got the web. I love it. David Lamb asks, where do you see the greatest career development opportunities for seasoned external managers and producers? External managers and producers.
Yeah. I think that being able to manage clusters of work and manage clusters of distributed work is going to be the biggest area of career development. I'll say what I hear from our studio heads is that so many of us had a leadership approach of walking the shop floor. And I would always say that you could spend a day at a game studio and come away with a pretty good sense of how they're working and what they're, we like to be there. And that we just haven't had that tool for the last year and a half. And the people that have succeeded are people who are good at building, for lack of a better word, pods, teams that are working together in small clusters and have got that sort of program management, project management ability to create cohesiveness out of that. So, you could look at any one of our big games like Halo, like Minecraft, the number of external partners we've got is in the dozens. And the people that can kind of create this mental map of this virtual team and know who needs attention when, and where technology can make something easier, where it's a relationship problem rather than a technology problem. Those are the stars of the future. I mean, you look at something like an executive producer that works at our Turn 10 studio that is responsible for maintaining Forza Horizon 4, shipping new Forza Horizon 5, working on Fable with Playground. Like that's a big virtual team, and the people that can navigate that and bring those people together, I think that's really those are the superstars of the future.
What do you say to, because I imagine that there's a tremendous amount of competition in co-dev, people vying for contracts and stuff, but I think there also has to be a great deal of partnership and empathy and understanding that a few co-dev companies could be working on a massive project like a Forza or something. What do you say to these different companies to kind of, continue to play nice and to work together to get some of these massive ideas realized?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a given, right? I think that's just going to be a given. They're going to be part of it. And in some ways, these things go in phases, but it used to be, when I was back in the, before the Clone Wars, you'd go see Empire Strikes Back and the special effects were Industrial Light and Magic. That's it.
Yeah.
And then you go watch a movie today and it's probably 20 to 30 effects companies work together on that, right?
And then they subcontract out to individuals out there that are doing it in their garages. I know, it's incredible. Yes.
And the thing is that they're all working to build something that you can't, the movie viewer can't see those seams, right? So everybody's got to work together to bring it together. I'll just say that my experience through our teams working with our various co-dev partners is I have not run into that sort of competitiveness. Like maybe it happens during the biz dev phase, maybe it happens when we're vying for contracts, but I would be hard pressed to come up with an example of where I felt that they were working at odds with each other, because I think everybody understands that longevity and getting more projects and, being able to, even potentially turn what starts out, like look at something like Certain Affinity, where they've certainly done a whole lot of co-dev work, but then they've also got people working on original IP. That I think that you don't get there without being just a good partner to the main production team, but also the other people that are involved.
Junie's got another all-star question. Our industry is ever changing more rapidly and unpredictably every day. How do you prioritize whittling down thousands of opportunities in projects, tech, business models, etc., to those most eligible for success?
Yeah, there is an awful lot. That's just a place where I really rely on the game teams. And I know this will sound a little bit like trying to take the back door out of the question, but I'm not. I think nobody knows better where to take a game than the game team that is working on it every day, right? So let's just pick something like Minecraft, let's just even look, there's no mystery here. We've had some challenges getting Halo Infinite done. I feel great about where we're at, but we've had some challenges. But I just look at how that team has been direct and transparent with their community and how they've worked with them. And then, okay, wow, we thought this made sense to go this way. We're hearing something, we want to go this way. Like in terms of that whole field of opportunities, I really feel that's where you've got to leave it to the people day in and day out that are working on the game, listening to the community, know what's possible. And that's how you get things like Minecraft dungeons, right? Like nobody came in and said, hey, wouldn't it be fun to go make a Minecraft dungeon crawler? That was 3 people in the studio that said, we think this could be something cool. And then it's really just my job to try to go find them money. So I think that, there are for sure more things that we could go do than we have the time and the money to go do. That's why I always chuckle a little bit when people say, I've got this great idea for a game. And I'm like, we got years worth of game ideas. It's not the problem. But the problem is if you can find me enough teams to go build them, right? I think we're capacity constrained more than anything else. So it's a good question. We got to be smart about where we put our resources for sure.
I've got one last question for you, and it applies to the indie developer community out there, which is incredibly important as our industry has kind of moved away from AA. We sort of rely on indie stuff. Should they be looking at outsourcing opportunities or outsourcing partners? And how do you do that on a smaller scale effectively?
Yeah, I think it's kind of, as we said, and I'm not doing it day to day, but I just couldn't imagine not doing it. I think it just happens at a different scale, and it may take different forms, right? I mean, you may be an indie developer and it turns out that the music that you're going to use in your game is actually sort of already been produced. You're going to pay to get a license for it. And then your job is going to be to edit it and make it work in your game, all the way to you might contract with one person who's able to create the music at the scale you need, or contract with one artist. So I think, it's probably, I'll go back to, if hypothetically you and I go start a game studio, probably the first person that we need to add to the team would be someone to go manage and just help us do those sorts of things. To find the partners. Go find somebody to help us do music, find somebody to help us do animation, the things that we just can't get done. You probably need that person. Now, that isn't to say you can't go Stardew Valley and just like do the whole thing yourself, but I got to imagine on any project, whether it's one person, 2 people, 10 people, that there's still going to be some amount of things you're going to look externally to get. Yeah, important at every scale. Yes. That's going to do it for our time with you today. And man, I had a great time. You're a fantastic interview, and you have so many different areas of your career and so many different things to focus on. Congratulations on all the work that you're doing and all the success that Xbox is enjoying right now. It's really wonderful to see. And thank you on behalf of everybody at XDS. We had a great time having you here. I really appreciate the chance to chat with everybody. Thank you very much. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Matt Booty, head of Xbox Game Studios. Thank you, everyone. Stay tuned. There is a lot more great XDS content headed your way.